The sea never asks you to hurry. It was late June, the air still damp from morning fog when I first noticed him. Shoulders hunched beneath a too-thick jacket, sneakers soaking on the wet planks of the dock like he hadn't known the tide would rise. He wasn't built for places like this. The city clung to him even in the way he stood, awkwardly still, like a question waiting for permission to be asked. I was painting a stripped fishing boat then, pale yellow, cracked along the edges. It had belonged to a man who vanished in 2006 and left nothing behind but the sound of his radio echoing from the hull. I liked boats with stories, even sad ones. He watched me for nearly 15 minutes before saying a word. "You always paint this early?" His voice was low, careful, like he wasn't sure if he was interrupting something sacred. Maybe he was. I dipped the brush again, blue this time, the color of stormlit water, and looked at him through my lashes. "I always paint when the tide allows." He smiled at that, not wide, not polite, the kind of smile that felt like it used to mean something but had forgotten how. There were faint circles under his eyes, as though sleep had become an outdated luxury, and in that quiet, with gulls wheeling overhead and the scent of salt curling in the air, he offered his name. "Ewan. I'm visiting, for a while." I didn't ask why. The people who came to our town always had reasons they didn't want to say out loud. Some were hiding, some were healing, some were just trying to remember how to breathe. He sat on the edge of the dock and let his legs dangle above the water. His shoes were ruined. He didn't seem to care. "Can I watch you work?" That was the beginning. Days folded into days, and he kept returning. Not with questions, not with conversation, but with a kind of silent companionship that didn't ask for anything. He brought coffee once. Terrible, too sweet, in a paper cup that had gone soggy at the edges. He left it beside my easel like an offering. He learned quickly. I taught him how to patch wooden seams with resin, how to sand down old hulls until the grain shone like polished skin. He was clumsy at first, kept getting splinters, kept swearing under his breath. I wrapped his hand once when a splinter went in deep. He stared at my fingers like they were something unfamiliar, something warm. "I'm supposed to be recovering," he said one afternoon, voice thick with paint fumes and sunlight. "Burnout, stress, all that." His eyes didn't meet mine. They stared out at the line where sky met ocean. My uncle said I needed to disappear for a while. I think he meant it metaphorically, but his gaze flicked to me, sharp and sudden. "Do you ever feel like the world only values you when you're useful?" I knew that feeling too well. "They only see the surface," I murmured, "and forget what held the boat together underneath." He didn't say anything after that, but the next day he came without his phone, and the day after, without his watch. There was something about the way he looked at me. Not like I was beautiful, though sometimes when the sunlight hit his face and he forgot to speak, I wondered if he thought it. No, he looked at me like I was familiar. Like I reminded him of something he'd lost and was trying to remember without breaking. I saw it in the way his eyes lingered on my paint-stained fingers, the way he waited for me to laugh at his crooked repairs, the way he touched the dock railing like it had weight, like it might tether him to something real. Then one day, without ceremony, he pulled out a knife. He crouched beside the edge of the dock, right where the planks met the stone seawall, and began carving into the wood with steady hands. I said nothing, though my chest tightened at the act. The dock was old, sacred in its way. Marking it meant something. His hair was falling into his eyes. He kept pushing it back with the heel of his palm. The carving took minutes. When he finished, he stepped back, wiped the blade against his jeans, and read it aloud, softly. "When it rains, I'll return, so wait here." I've stared at the words, each one imperfect, uneven, but real, like him. He looked up at me, and there it was again, that hesitation, that unspoken "if you let me in" his gaze. "I'll be back soon, a few weeks at most. I need to deal with something, family things." I hated how vague he sounded, hated how easily people vanished when they said things like that. But I nodded, because hope is a strange, irrational thing, and I wanted to believe him. He took a step closer. I didn't move. And then his hands were cupping my face, gently, reverently, like he was afraid the sea might wash me away if he didn't anchor me down. When he kissed me, it wasn't soft. It was desperate. A memorization, like he knew he wouldn't get another chance. His lips trembled. Mine did too. The ocean groaned behind us. A gull cried somewhere far away. I tasted goodbye before he ever said it. "I'll come back, Unse," he whispered, forehead pressed to mine. "You'll see. Next time it rains." And then he was gone, jacket over his shoulder, that ruined pair of sneakers still wet. I watched him walk the curve of the coastline until he disappeared behind the cliffs. The dock creaked under my feet as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of something shifting. I looked down at his carving. "When it rains, I'll return." Clouds gathered in the distance. And I waited. The first letter came a week later. I still remember the scent of the paper, the kind that smells faintly of old books and dried flowers. When I unfolded it, a single petal fluttered out, landing gently on the floor at my feet. A forget-me-not, pale and fragile. His handwriting was unpracticed, the letters slanting awkwardly across the page. It was just a flower, just a letter. Why did it feel like a promise? He wrote about the sound of the sea, how it calmed him when his thoughts were too loud. He wrote about the smell of salt on the wind, about the way the air here felt different, less suffocating. He wrote that he thought of me when he heard the waves hit the shore, when he saw the way my brush danced along the wooden boat hulls like the rhythm of the tides. It was the first hint of something I could cling to. The second letter came 2 weeks later. Again, the same pressed flower, this time a violet, pale and translucent, pressed between the folds of the paper. The handwriting had become a little more fluid, the words slightly more familiar. "I miss the sound of the waves against your easel," he wrote. "I miss the quiet of the mornings when I would sit beside you, watching you paint like time had nothing to do with us. I miss the way you hold the brush, as if you could make the world stop with just one stroke." I folded that letter so carefully, as though the paper might splinter if I pressed it too hard. The thought of him remembering me, the way I held my brushes, the way the wind tugged at my hair, the way the waves crashed on the rocks near the dock. I wanted to hold on to that. I wanted to believe he missed it. Missed me. By the time the third letter came, it had been 3 weeks since I'd heard his voice. "Fall," he promised in his third letter. "I'll be back by fall." He wrote with the certainty that only a person with an end in sight could. He described his family, the things he had to tend to, the weight of responsibility he had to shoulder. The letter, though filled with warmth, was also heavy with his absence. I could almost hear the tiredness in his words, the exhaustion that filled his sentences like the tide slowly coming in. He signed it with a flourish, and under his name he added one line. "I'll come back to you and say, wait for me, I'll be back." I kept that letter tucked inside my favorite book, tucked in where no one could see it, where no one would dare open it. I couldn't risk anyone finding the fragile strings of hope I had wrapped around those words. And then silence. Weeks passed, days blurred together like paint smudged against a canvas. The letters stopped coming, one by one, until they were no more. I waited. I waited as the heat of summer faded and the cool winds of fall began to sweep across the coast. I waited as the trees began to turn, as the docks saw fewer boats and the town fell into its familiar hibernation, the nights colder, the mornings grayer. I waited for his voice to return, for another letter, for any sign that he hadn't forgotten me. The silence, heavy, unrelenting, pressed against me like the weight of a storm cloud. The uncertainty swirled inside me like a whirlpool. Had he moved on? Had I been nothing more than a fleeting escape, a momentary distraction from his life? I dialed his number once, twice. It was disconnected. I pressed my forehead to the cool wood of the dock, as if somehow it could offer me an answer, a final explanation. But no explanation came, only the lapping of waves against the rocks, soft and unbothered by my questions. They didn't know. The people around me, the friends who knew about him, about the promises he'd carved into the dock, the letters, the flower petals, kept telling me to move on. They didn't know how it felt to sit in the stillness, to wait when the world told you to stop. They didn't understand what it meant to believe in a person who had left a part of themselves behind with you, to carry that promise in your chest like a second heartbeat. They didn't know what it was like to love someone who didn't even remember who you were anymore. I kept writing. At first it was easy. Words came and filled the empty spaces, and I pretended for a while that he was still listening. I wrote about the boats, I wrote about the town, I wrote about the stars that came out at night, and the way the tide always seemed to pull the same way when the moon was full. And then, gradually, I stopped writing for him. I wrote to no one. I would start letters and then tear them up. I would write, "I miss you," and then cross it out. My heart couldn't say the words anymore. He wasn't there, not really. He was just a memory I had carved into a dock, just a promise written on paper that time had erased. I didn't know then that he was gone for a reason I would never understand. A staged accident, one his uncle orchestrated to clear him from the family's way. A plot so deep, so intricately wound into the fabric of his family's power, it had swallowed him whole. I didn't know that Jiwon, my Jiwon, was lying in a hospital bed, a shadow of himself, his body broken, his mind fractured, a coma, a fading thread between life and nothingness. They told him nothing. They didn't let him remember. They erased me, erased us, and left him to wake in a world that had already moved on without him. I didn't know that when he finally opened his eyes, he wouldn't remember how he had ever loved me. The last time I heard about him, it was from someone else. Someone who saw his name on a legal document, on a luxury resort's brochure. They spoke of him as if he had always been someone else, someone who wasn't mine, someone who would never remember the sound of the waves against my easel or the way he used to carve promises on a dock. I waited. But the Jiwon I had known was lost, buried in the lie his family had woven around him. And the person who woke up in his place wasn't the same. The seasons changed without my permission. First, it was the heat, thick and oppressive like a blanket pulled too tight. Then, before I could even recall the days in between, the autumn breeze slipped in, cold and crisp, laced with the scent of wet earth. The summer had passed. So had fall. And the winter, with its icy grip, whispered promises of spring. Each change felt like a blow, though none of them were enough to tear me from the place where I waited. I would sit by the dock, my eyes tracing the same horizon, looking for the faintest trace of him on the water, looking for something, anything, that would suggest the world had been kinder to him than it had been to me. I waited through storms and sunshine. I waited through empty days and long nights that stretched endlessly. One season bled into another, as though time had caught my heart in a slow-moving tide, dragging it along with the current, never allowing it to rest. The villagers saw me. They whispered behind their hands, shaking their heads, their eyes pitying or mocking. Poor girl, still waiting for a ghost. He'll never come back. That kind of love is always a fantasy. Some tourists came to the dock, fresh-faced and eager for the simplicity of the coast. They never noticed me, just the empty boat I had been fixing. The boat Jiwon and I had shared once, with laughter in the air and salt in our veins. The tourists would ask about the boat, but when I answered, my voice would catch, and they would shuffle away quickly, embarrassed for me. For them, it was just a passing glance, an impression of a woman who could never let go. Why was I still here? Some days, I wondered if the very salt water that carried me here all those years ago had turned against me, pulling me deeper with every wave. Every day I thought it would get easier, letting go the weight of him. But it never did. The memory of his hands carving that promise into the wood, his words still a breath in my chest, haunted me. The way he had kissed me, promising to return. How could I forget that? I repaired his boat, our boat. Each stroke of the brush and each layer of resin, a futile attempt to hold the pieces of him that had shattered in my heart. Every time I touched the wood, I could hear the echo of his voice in the back of my mind. I could feel him beside me, yet the space between us stretched wider with every passing day. Some nights, when the sea was especially harsh, I would climb into the boat, curled in the hollow of its ribs like I was hiding from the wind, from the loneliness, from the realization that the dock no longer smelled like him, but only of salt and decay. I painted the boat again, each stroke a whisper of what we had once shared. I mixed the colors like I mixed my thoughts. Too much of this, not enough of that. Trying to make something beautiful out of pieces that no longer fit together. I painted stormlight, the hues of the dark clouds that hung over the horizon, the hues of my heart. Dark, fractured, fading into something unrecognizable. Each stroke of the brush was a prayer. It had been over a year without a letter, a year without his voice, and yet there I was, still waiting. I laughed at myself sometimes bitterly as I worked, laughed because there was no reason for me to still be here. The world had continued to turn, while I had been stuck in the same moment, glued to that dock, a ghost tethered to something lost. Sometimes I cried so hard that the sound of my sobs seemed to mingle with the wind, and I would wonder if it was the ocean echoing my despair. If it was the sea calling me to let go, to surrender, to let the waves take me with them. Why haven't I? Why haven't I just left it all behind? I would bury my head in the crook of my arms, my fingers trembling against the wood of the boat, trying to push the tears back. Sometimes it felt like they would never stop. Sometimes it felt like there was no hope left. And still I stayed. The boat sat on the dock, weathered, like me. I was still here because I couldn't let go. But did I even believe in him anymore? Every time I read the words carved into the dock, I felt something snap within me. When it rains, I'll return. He had promised, and I had waited. I would sit there, eyes fixed on the carving, watching the water ripple beneath the wood, and wonder when the promise had turned to ashes. And yet, I never moved. Not because I believed anymore, because I didn't know how not to. The days stretched like a slow, creeping fog. Sometimes I would walk down the street and see the faces of people I had known for years. They knew nothing of the ache inside me, the quiet hurt that pulled at the edges of my soul. They didn't know the years I had spent living in limbo, in a place where I couldn't move forward or back, trapped between hope and regret. They didn't see the woman I had become, the one who painted alone in the dusk, the one who still waited by the dock, watching as the horizon never changed. A soft wind came up, and I shivered despite the warmth of the sun on my skin. I stood and walked to the end of the dock. My fingers brushed the weathered wood of the railing, the same place where he had carved his promise. When it rains, I'll return. It was worn now, barely legible. Time had faded it, just as it had faded everything else. I closed my eyes, feeling the pull of the sea, the way it wrapped itself around my body like an old memory I couldn't shake. The tide lapped against the shore, rhythmic and constant, just like the ache in my chest. What did I have left? The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the water, turning everything into gold and lavender. I looked up. The first cloud of the evening, dark and heavy, rolled in from the horizon. The sky shifted, the scent of rain thick in the air. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. If it rained, would he come? 3 years later, I thought I had learned how to breathe again. I thought the waiting was over. I had moved past the endless days spent staring at that carved promise, past the hollow ache that threatened to swallow me whole each time the wind swept across the docks. I had painted, rebuilt, and mended the boat again and again, with each layer of color a fragile attempt at starting anew. Then, one morning, I heard them. The engines roared in the distance, their deep hum cutting through the quiet of the coast. At first, I thought it was the usual fleet of fishermen making their way out to sea, their boats creaking under the weight of nets and hopes. But then, I saw them. Black cars, sleek and imposing, lining the edge of the pier. A convoy of power, a fleet of shadows, rolling in like a storm. I had heard rumors. Whispers in the cafe, murmurs on the streets about a new project. The development of a luxury marina. The town was talking about it, some hopeful, some suspicious. The newcomers were rich, ambitious. They had money, they had plans, and they didn't care much for anything except what they could own. Never imagined the man leading it would be him. Theo J1. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. It had been so long since I'd heard it, since I had felt it on my tongue, since I had whispered it in my heart during lonely nights by the dock. His name was once a promise, a tether. Now it felt like a ghost. He stepped out of one of the black cars, tall and composed, his suit sharp, his posture straight. The sunlight caught the edges of his perfectly tailored coat, the gleam of polished shoes. He looked nothing like the man I remembered. Wild-eyed and free, the boy who carved promises into the dock like they could hold time still. This man, the man who stood before me now, was a stranger. He wore his name like armor, like something he could hide behind, clean-cut, ruthless. Surrounded by people who hadn't once let their skin touch the sea, who didn't understand what it was to stand in the salt of the air and wait for something you couldn't have. I stood there, hidden behind the dock's thick posts, watching him move. I could see the lines of authority in his gait, the clipped way he spoke to the men around him. He didn't even glance at the water, didn't seem to care that he had returned to the place where he'd promised to be, to the place where I had waited. And I felt a sharp, biting sensation in my chest, the kind of pain that doesn't come from physical injury, but from something deeper. This was not the man I had waited for. This was not the man I had loved. He walked past me without so much as a flicker of recognition. His eyes never met mine. He didn't even slow his step. I could have called out to him, could have screamed his name, but I didn't. He wouldn't have heard me. He didn't even know me, not anymore. His eyes passed over the dock he had carved with such care, the dock that still bore his promise like a raw wound in the wood. He didn't see it. He didn't see the piece of him still buried here where I had waited, where I had lived waiting. The breeze tugged at my hair, and I shivered, though it wasn't cold. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him why he had come back only to walk past me like a stranger. I wanted to shout that I had waited for him, that I had been here for him all this time. I looked at his face. So familiar, so distant. He was still beautiful in that harsh, unapproachable way. The jawline that had once softened with affection now hardened with authority. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cold, calculating, businesslike. Did he even remember? My heart thudded in my chest as I stood frozen, as if the very act of moving would break something inside me. The years of waiting, the years of silence, they meant nothing to him now. Had they ever? And then he turned his head, just slightly, just enough for his eyes to catch mine. It was a glance, a fleeting moment. He didn't stop, he didn't say my name. His lips curled into a smile, polite and professional, like he was greeting a stranger, like I was no more than another face in a crowd. That smile, it was the same smile, the one I had seen in my memories 1,000 times, the one that had once made my heart race. But now it meant nothing. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, carrying a polite distance. His eyes never lingered on me for more than a fraction of a second, as if I were just another part of the landscape. "Can you direct me to the town hall?" I stood there, my throat tight, my breath caught in the sudden storm of emotions that whipped through me. So this was it. This was the man who had promised to return. This was the man who had broken everything. He didn't recognize me. He didn't remember. He walked away from me as easily as he had walked away from the dock, from the promise he'd carved into the wood. My heart shattered. The tears came before I could stop them, and I turned away, not wanting him to see, not wanting to admit how much I had hoped for him to remember, how much I had still believed in him. I stumbled back toward the dock, toward the boat I had rebuilt, the boat that had never been used, the boat that was still there, waiting for him. Why had I waited so long? I couldn't answer that question, not in the moment. I could only look down at the carving, the words that had once filled me with hope and now filled me with hollow regret. When it rains, I'll return. The words blurred before my eyes as the rain began to fall. I never planned to see him again. I had nearly convinced myself that the past could stay buried, that the man I had loved, the man I had waited for, was someone who no longer existed, someone lost in time, in memory, in promises that had turned to dust. I had painted over that memory, layer after layer, hoping to smooth out the rough edges. But life, like the sea, has a way of forcing its tides back onto the shore no matter how far you try to push them. It was a small errand, a quick delivery of paints to a vendor on the cliffside restaurant that had been built just before the development started. The winds there were sharper, the salt air heavier. As I carried the heavy canvas bag with the paints inside, my thoughts were elsewhere. The dock, the boat, the steady pulse of waiting that I had come to know as a part of my own breath. I hadn't expected to see him there, but I did. He was standing by the large windows of the restaurant, framed by the soft golden light of the evening, wearing a suit that looked like it belonged to a man who commanded cities instead of people. His hair was slicked back, his features sharper now, colder. The man who had walked past me on the pier, the stranger in his own skin, was now transformed into someone else entirely. Someone who didn't belong to this coast anymore. He had become the version of himself he had once promised he wouldn't. I froze, and then I saw her. She was there beside him, her laugh ringing out like a bell, clear and loud, effortlessly drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Gia. She was glamorous in a way that made everything around her dull in comparison. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, her dress clinging to her body in a way that demanded gazes. She wore confidence like a second skin, a kind of self-assuredness that left no room for doubt, no room for the quiet hesitancy that used to exist between us. They looked right together, a perfect match, at least on the surface. She touched his hand, light, teasing, a gesture that was meant to mean something. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He didn't do anything except smile at her, his eyes soft in a way they had never been for me. That smile, it was the one I remembered. It was the one I had tried to forget, the one I had held onto for so long, thinking it was a promise. But now, it wasn't for me. It wasn't for the woman who had waited by the dock for years. It was for her. For Gia, the woman who was here, beside him, taking the place I once thought was mine. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I didn't cry. What would be the point? Instead, I turned away and walked out the door, my hand clutching the canvas bag like it might shatter under the weight of my grip. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but the sound was deafening in my ears. The light of the restaurant, the warmth inside, all seemed to stretch further and further away with each step I took. When I got home, I locked myself in the studio. The familiar smell of paint, the brushes, the canvases, all of it felt cold now, like a place that had once been mine, but had become foreign in my absence. I could still hear the sound of Gia's laughter in my mind, still see the way her fingers had trailed along his skin, so casually, like she had every right to be there. How could I have been so foolish? I walked across the room, my fingers trembling as I reached for the last sketch I had made of him, the one where he was laughing, free and alive, beneath a half-built sail. It had been the last image I had of him in my mind before the silence swallowed everything. The man I had known, before he became someone else, entirely. I hadn't wanted to tear it up, not really, but my hands moved without asking for permission. The sound of the paper ripping was like a scream I couldn't make. It was too loud in the quiet of the room. My chest tightened, and my fingers shook harder, leaving smudges of graphite on the paper. Piece by piece, I pulled the sketch apart. I tore it into smaller pieces until there was nothing left but fragments, a man broken down into dust and paper. He was gone, not physically. He had returned, his body filling out the space that had once been filled with the boy I had known, the boy who had carved promises into the dock, who had kissed me with the weight of the ocean behind him. But that man, the one I had loved, the one who had promised to return, was never coming back. I stood there, surrounded by the shredded remnants of him, the pieces of what I had believed to be real, and my breath came in ragged sobs. There was no one left to hear me, no one left to share the pain of this realization. The weight of the years of waiting, the weight of all that hope, crushed me in that moment. I had stayed, I had waited, and he hadn't. I went outside, the cold night air biting against my skin. The sky stretched above me, black and endless, as though it had swallowed up everything I had once thought was true. The dock stood there, unchanged by time, its wooden posts still marked by the promise he had carved. The rain began to fall, soft and steady, like the heavens were crying along with me. I walked to the edge of the dock, my fingers brushing the smooth wood. My heart was heavier than it had ever been, a stone lodged in my chest, a weight that I had carried for so long, thinking it was all I had. Beneath the old carving, I etched a new one. It rained, I stayed, you didn't. The words were sharp, final, a truth I had to face, even if I didn't want to. I stood there, my eyes stinging from both the rain and the grief, the weight of years pressing down on me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the tiniest breath of release. Felt like fate, cruel, unforgiving fate, that forced our paths to cross again. I should have known that the world had a twisted sense of humor, that somehow the years I had spent waiting, the silence I had swallowed like a bitter pill, would culminate in this. Painting for his project. Painting for the man who no longer remembered me, who no longer cared to. I was hired to design the public art installations for the new marina, a luxury resort that was replacing the coast I had once known, replacing the dock where I had waited. I was the only certified muralist in the region, the only one whose work was considered valuable enough for a place like this. They wanted my art. They wanted the memory of the coast, the soul of it, but not the people who lived here. Not me. I hadn't known he was involved when I accepted the job. When the call came, I thought it was just another commission, another chance to paint and escape the endless loop of waiting. The contract had been signed before I saw his name, before I knew that Seo Jiwon was the one behind the resort. When I walked into the project's headquarters, there he was, standing by a wall of blueprints, his back straight, his eyes sharp as they flicked over the plans. He didn't notice me at first. How could he? I was a stranger now, no more than a name on a page, a woman hired to paint the place he had built. He had become the kind of man who belonged in a boardroom, not on the dock. The man I had loved, the man who had carved promises into wood, had disappeared into the distance, buried beneath suits, deadlines, and corporate ambitions. And there I was, painting for him, painting for a stranger. He watched me work, his eyes always following the movements of my hand, the way my brush seemed to bleed the sadness of the ocean itself. I couldn't help it. The colors I chose were muted, restrained. The brushstrokes were slow, deliberate, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. My art was a mirror of my heart, torn between the past I could never forget and the present I couldn't fully embrace. I didn't look at him when I worked. I didn't want to. I didn't want to feel the bitterness of his gaze, or the weight of the fact that he had moved on while I had stayed behind. But I could feel it. The distance between us was thick, suffocating. Every time I dipped my brush into the paint, I could almost feel him there, his gaze fixed on me like a heavy hand on my shoulder. The storm came without warning. The wind picked up suddenly, turning the sea gray and violent. The lighthouse lights flickered, then went out entirely, leaving the whole building in darkness. The thunder cracked above us, a low growl that seemed to shake the air. I stood still for a moment, waiting for the power to come back, for the lights to flicker back to life. But they didn't. The sound of the storm filled the space, loud and unruly, as if nature itself were trying to drown out the silence between us. The power was gone, the phones were useless. The rain beat against the windows, a relentless drum of sound. And then, without warning, he spoke. "Looks like we're stuck here," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. He was too close now, standing in the doorway of the small storage room where I had been painting. His eyes seemed to soften in the dim light, but there was no recognition there. Only curiosity. "Guess so," I said quietly, turning back to the half-finished mural on the wall. My fingers gripped the brush tighter, as though it might steady me in the storm. We stood there for a long time. The storm raged outside, its fury against the building, but the silence inside was thick, suffocating. I tried to ignore him, tried to bury myself in the paint, in the swirling colors that I knew by heart. I wanted to forget, to erase him from my thoughts. But I couldn't. The past had never really let me go. Then, as if guided by some invisible force, he walked toward the small table where my sketchbook lay, the one filled with old drawings of the coast, the one where I had once drawn him, over and over again, before the world had changed. He flipped through it, quietly at first, as if not realizing the significance of what he was holding. His fingers brushed the edges of the pages, the faint trace of graphite, the smudged lines, as if they were nothing more than a forgotten memory. I could hear his breathing, steady, deep, as he turned each page. I could hear his voice, low, as he whispered, Who am I to you?" I stopped. I couldn't breathe. "Who are you to me?" I closed my eyes. I should have said something. I should have told him everything. How I had waited, how I had loved him, how I had kept the promise alive for so long that it became part of me, even when it was clear he had forgotten it all. But instead, I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of his question, unable to speak the truth. "Someone who used to keep promises," I said, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes flicked to me, searching for something, an answer, a hint of recognition, but I saw it then. The confusion, the emptiness. It was as though I wasn't a person at all, just another figure in the background of his new life. I wasn't the woman he remembered. I wasn't the woman he had promised to return to. He looked down at the sketchbook again, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned to a page where I had drawn him laughing, a version of him that no longer existed. I don't remember," he said quietly. He wasn't asking. He was just stating a fact. And in that moment, I realized I was already gone. The man I had known, the one who had promised me forever, was never coming back. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if it too had heard the words. I turned away, unable to look at him anymore. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand there and pretend that the past had any meaning to him anymore. I stood at the window, my heart pounding in my chest as the rain soaked the earth outside. He didn't say anything. Neither of us did. We were two strangers, trapped in a room together, with nothing but silence between us. I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the storm that kept me awake. The rain had fallen in heavy sheets, the wind howling like it had a story to tell. The lighthouse light flickered intermittently, cutting through the night. But none of it mattered. What kept me awake was something far more uncomfortable, something gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, a truth I had buried, something lost inside me that now screamed for release, a piece of myself that I had forgotten but could not leave behind. The question that haunted me, the question I had never let myself ask before, who am I without her? Had moved so far from the man I was before. I had closed the door on that life, on the man who carved promises in wood, on the man who let love slip through his fingers like sand. I had buried him under a name, Seo Jiwon, and locked the memories away in a place I couldn't bear to visit. But something about her, about Unse, was pulling me back. She had been so real, so vivid in the sketches, in the promises carved deep into the dock. She had become a ghost to me, a shadow who clung to something I couldn't remember, something I didn't know how to reclaim. I had to go back. I didn't know why, but I was drawn to the dock like a man stumbling in a dream, guided by a force that didn't care if I understood it. I grabbed my coat, slipped into shoes that had no purpose here, and walked into the storm. The world was a blur of rain when I reached the dock. The boards creaked beneath my feet as I approached the boat, the one she had rebuilt with her hands, the one that had once been filled with promises, with laughter, with hope. Now it was half sunk, forgotten, left to rot like everything else I had abandoned. I didn't understand why it affected me so much. The boat, the sight of it with the saltwater creeping up its sides, the cracks in the hull. It wasn't just the boat. It was everything that had gone wrong. Everything I had lost. I stepped closer, my feet slipping on the wet wood. Then I saw it. A rusted toolbox inside the boat, the lid half open. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I pulled it out, almost afraid of what I might find. And there it was, a blood-stained cloth, stiff with age and dried rust. My heart skipped a beat. The cloth was torn and weathered, but the memory of it hit me like a lightning strike. It was the cloth Unsei had used to wrap my bleeding hand. The pain, the scent, the sound of her voice. I hadn't thought about that day in so long, how we had been together, how she had cared for me when everything else was falling apart. I had carved that promise into the dock with my own hands, bleeding into the wood as she held me, her fingers gentle against my skin. I had kissed her then, under the tarp, the moonlight pooling around us, bathing her in its silver glow. I remembered how she had looked at me, how her eyes had held something I didn't understand until now. Her hands, cradling my palm, the kiss under the tarp, the moonlight on her collarbone, her voice soft and steady, calling my name like it mattered. I could feel the weight of it all now. The moments I had buried deep within me, the memories I had forgotten, how they had been mine once, how they were still mine. Our memories, carved into time, into the wood of the dock, into my skin. Staggered back, my breath caught in my chest, my knees buckled, and before I knew it, I was on the ground, my hands gripping the edge of the boat, my fingers slick with rain and memory. The storm raged above me, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside of me. I remembered all of it. The boy who had carved promises into the wood. The man who had forgotten. The girl who had waited. The love that had once been real. The woman who had poured herself into something that had never been returned. I slammed my fist into the wet wood of the boat, my mind reeling with everything I had thrown away. I had been the one who left. I had been the one who chose the world over her. The storm didn't care. The rain kept falling, the wind still howling. I could feel the weight of her absence like a suffocating hand around my throat. Why had I done it? Why had I forgotten her? And then I realized it wasn't just about the boat. It wasn't just about the promise. It was about the man I had become. The man I had built out of lies and ambition. A man who had forgotten what it meant to love, to remember, to keep promises. A man who had moved on, leaving the parts of himself that had been real behind. The Olympics were home. I remembered us, and it tore me apart. I stood there, the rain mixing with the tears I hadn't known I was shedding. The weight of it all was too much to bear, but I couldn't look away from the wreckage I had created, from the damage I had done to both of us. I ran my hand over the rough surface of the boat as if trying to touch something that had been lost to me forever. I could still feel the warmth of her touch, the softness of her voice, the way she had looked at me with so much trust, so much hope. I didn't know what to do with all of it, the past, the pain, the memory of a love I had shattered without even realizing it. And in that moment, I understood the cost of everything I had chosen, the world I had built, the empire I had created. It was nothing compared to the love I had lost, the woman I had left behind. I fell to my knees again, my heart breaking all over. The storm howled around me, but all I could hear was the sound of her voice, calling me back, asking me why I hadn't come sooner. I remembered I had never really forgotten her. The storm was unforgiving. The rain lashed against me like 1,000 tiny needles, each drop a reminder of the years I had spent walking away from the truth. The sky above was dark and swollen, as though it too had gathered all the weight I had ignored, waiting to drown me in its fury. I didn't care. I ran through the mud, my shoes sinking with each desperate step, my breath ragged, but none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the figure I saw by the shore. She was standing there, under the cloak of rain, her figure stoic against the torrent, the wind tugging at her hair, her face turned slightly toward the horizon as though she were already far away. Her bags were packed, her future slipping away with the setting sun. And say, I could barely see her through the downpour, but I knew it was her. I felt it in the pit of my stomach. I had seen her, carved her into my heart so many times in my memory that even in this storm, I couldn't mistake her. She was here. She was still here. And she was leaving. My heart pounded louder than the thunder above. I called her name, breathless, desperate, the sound of my voice lost in the wind. I'd say, she turned slowly, the movement deliberate, as though she had already accepted the inevitability of this moment. There was no hope in her eyes. There was only the weight of the years she had spent waiting for me. Waiting for a version of me that no longer existed. I'd forgotten. I had chosen everything else over her. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now cold, a void that mirrored the years of silence I had left between us. She didn't speak at first. The rain fell between us, a barrier neither of us could cross easily. She was leaving. She had already left. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words hit me like a slap to the face. You remembered because it hurt, she said, her voice steady, as though she had already said goodbye in her heart long before I had found the courage to run after her. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to say anything that might bridge the gap between us. But there was nothing I could say that would undo the damage, nothing that would erase the years I had stolen from her. She remembered because she waited, and I had never really understood that until now. I had never understood what it meant to wait for someone who couldn't even remember who you were. I took a step toward her, my hand trembling. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to hold her, to beg for forgiveness, to beg for a second chance. But I couldn't. The weight of my mistakes held me back, like an anchor tied to my feet. Instead, I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the familiar shape of the wooden ring, the one I had carried with me for so long, never truly knowing why I kept it. It had sat in my palm for years, a forgotten symbol of promises I had never kept. It had been for her all along. I opened my hand, revealing the ring, a small, simple thing cracked with time, its edges worn from years of waiting and regret. I couldn't speak the words I had wanted to say, so I held the ring out to her, my heart heavy with everything that had led me to this moment. I loved you once without memory, and once with it, I said, my voice breaking with the weight of everything I had lost. But this time, I'll earn both. The rain drummed down between us, filling the silence, filling the space where our words couldn't reach. Her gaze flickered to the ring in my hand, the faintest flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition, a pang of the love that still clung to the corners of her heart. She didn't cry. Her eyes were dry, but there was a sadness in them that I couldn't understand, one that had only grown deeper with time. She took the ring from my palm. Her fingers brushed mine, and in that brief moment, I felt everything we had been, everything we had lost, pass between us. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The years had already spoken for us, the silence between us louder than any words could be. She turned, not toward me, but toward the boat, the one we had once planned to sail in together, the boat I had promised to return to. She boarded it without looking back, her movements calm, resigned, as they followed her. The rain continued to fall as we sailed out into the night. The storm still raged above, but the sea was calmer now, as though the waves had understood something we hadn't yet. There was no grand music, no fanfare. There was only the sound of the boat cutting through the water, the rhythmic dip of the oars against the surface. It was quiet in a way that felt like the world had stopped, like the rain had washed away everything that had come before. There was nothing left but the two of us, finally aligned after all these years, two hearts, broken and whole at once, finally moving forward in the same direction. I sat beside her, the space between us smaller than it had ever been, but still there. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. For the first time in so long, I understood that the silence between us was not an absence. It was the presence of everything we had lost and everything we had found. And when we reached the dock, We didn't speak. But I saw the carving beneath the old promise. The words were different now, a final truth, a final vow. When it rains again, let it find us together. And it was enough. What we learn from this journey is simple, yet profound. Time may pass, promises may fade, and the world may change in ways we never expect, but the heart knows what it needs, the heart remembers. This story reminds us that healing begins when we confront our past and accept that growth sometimes comes from letting go. It's never too late to rebuild, to reconnect, and to choose love again. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think it means to remember someone, truly remember them? What do you think is the hardest part about waiting? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that speak to the heart.